So, mindful of people's time and the fact that this is intended to be a short strategic session, we'll move straight on to the second part of today's proceeding, which is to talk about the relaunch of the online journal, Languages, Society and Policy, which originates from one of the OWRI projects, which we'll hear more about in just a second. And I propose to go straight to an introduction by Dora Alexopoulou and Leanne Henderson. There'll then be a panel discussion immediately afterwards in which Wendy Ayres-Bennett, Ludovica Serratrice, Michelle MacLeod will say something. I'll also dip in a little bit with one or two observations from the IMLR. But let's get straight down to business. So Dora and Leanne.
Well, thank you to all for being here, and to Charles and Kathy for organizing this event and inviting us. So I'll say a few things about LSP before we get to our panel discussion. So we launched LSP, Languages, Society and Policy, an open access journal where we publish policy papers based on academic research in linguistics and modern languages. So we launched it in 2017 as part of Wendy Bennett's MEITS project. And a big thank you here to Wendy for endorsing the idea from the very beginning, and also writing a very successful bid to HRC. So we got the money and the context, the intellectual context to, to launch LSP. And the goal was to make research in linguistics and modern languages known to policy makers. And the first task, of course, was to find the papers. And in that respect, the experiment worked. We managed over a few years to find more than 30 colleagues who actually had important things to say about policy. And we have published more than 30 policy papers, some opinions as well. And what's more, it seems that people are reading the papers, people outside the academia reading the papers. We know that, first of all, by the numbers. The old website had exceeded 100,000 hits. Some of our most popular papers have been accessed by thousands of readers. These are just not numbers you get with the standard academic paper. Last year, the National Geographic picked Stolhan's paper and made a feature, a short article on the use of slang. Some of our papers have featured in the newsletter of the Royal Society of Speech Therapists. We have also had publications, joint publications with the magazine of the Charter College for Teaching. So we have established a number of links with key stakeholders, and there's good evidence that our papers are read more widely outside academia. But then when this project ran out, finished as project 2, so we had to find new sponsors, but it was also a good moment to think how we can build on the success we had, and to rethink the model and what was the best way to move forward. So we are delighted today to relaunch, supported by a consortium of learned societies and institutions who are very keen to work together to nurture a cross-disciplinary approach to research-based policy impact. So I would very much like now to thank the consortium members, and I will start with the hosts of today today's event, the Institute of Modern Languages Research, and special thanks to Director Charles Burdett, the Philological Society, and special thanks here owed to President Susan Fitzmaurice and Nancy Kula, and of course the Council of Philosophy that has endorsed the project, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, with special thanks to President Caroline Haycock, Treasurer Robert Traswell, for being very enthusiastic from the beginning, and of course to all LAG members who last year at their AGM at September very enthusiastically voted in favor of becoming a member of the consortium and supporting the project. And last but not least, the University Council of Modern Languages, and with thanks to Chair Emma Kelly and Vice Chair Liz Warren Owens, and of course the Executive Committee, who again very enthusiastically endorsed the project, and all of the individuals and the organizations. For not only their enthusiasm for providing the material support we need, but also their encouragement and direction and help in order to shape the next steps. So I would like now to turn to ask the co-editor, Leanne Henderson, to give you a short tour of our new website, which became live earlier this morning. And she will explain a bit more of what LSP is about. And then we'll continue with our panel discussion. Leanne?
Thank you, Dora. So hopefully that's me sharing my screen now. We always have this moment where we're not 100% sure. So yes, I'd like to welcome you all to the homepage of the new LSP website. And you'll see that we have this beautiful banner, which allows us to highlight new papers or spotlight previous papers in line with the issues of the day. LSP accepts 3 types of paper. So policy papers, opinion articles, and dialogues. And with the policy papers, we offer authors the opportunity to expand on the policy implications of their research in a format which is accessible to policymakers and stakeholders. Each of those policy papers should be based on an author's underlying peer-reviewed research. And these are papers of about 2,000 to 3,000 words connecting research and policy. And that could be discussing existing policies in light of new research or making policy recommendations on the basis of recent research. So we also accept proposals for policy paper collections. And we'll see here this very successful collection on language inequality led by Annette Zhao and Nicola McClelland. So for the relaunch, we have some new policy papers. We've uploaded one from Wendy Ayres-Bennett and Marco Hafner, providing policy recommendations relating to their hugely important recent report on the economic value of languages for the UK, which we've heard mentioned already today. So we hope to maybe hear some more on that from Wendy later. We have Karen Forbes at Cambridge considering the policy implications of identity-based pedagogy to support young people in claiming their multilingual identity. And we have a number of other contributions forthcoming over the coming weeks, and we hope that you'll stay tuned to LSP to see what we have to share with you. Our second format then is an opinion article. These are shorter pieces of around 1,000 words, which enable linguists and stakeholders to comment on topical issues. So they're reviewed only for tone and clarity, and that allows us to facilitate a short turnaround and respond in an agile way to current issues. So as we did last year for a special series of opinions from academics and practitioners on proposed GCSE modern languages reforms in England. So for the relaunch, we have a new opinion piece from Joseph Ford and Emmanuel Santos. And this piece provides a very thoughtful account of current work in the area of decolonising languages in UK higher education. So although it's an opinion piece, you will see from reading it that it's a deeply informed opinion which draws on extensive evidence and considers policy implications as well. So finally, we have dialogues, and that's a format to bring together a range of perspectives on particular language policy issues. So I'd also like to introduce you to our managing editor, Aline Toussaint, and our communications assistant, James Algie, both from the University of Cambridge. And any of you who've been involved with LSP over the years will know the invaluable support they offer to authors and to our team of associate editors. So we're also very grateful to them and to the associate editors for bringing LSP to the point that we've reached today. And we look forward to working alongside the consortium and all of you to ensure its success in this next phase. Anyone who knows me will know that I like to do a shameless plug at the end, okay? So hopefully what I've shown you gives you a flavour of the work that we've been doing at LSP, but anyone who has an idea for a policy paper or an opinion article, please check our guidelines for submission or get in touch, and we'd be happy to discuss any potential contributions. And we're particularly enthusiastic to explore potential policy implications with those of you who do research which doesn't have what we might think of as an obvious or a direct link with policy. So please do get in touch. Okay, that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leanne and Dora. To echo a comment that Jonathan's made in the chat, it looks fantastic and really powerfully presented. Let's move immediately to the panel discussion, which I think is arranged around 3 questions. So, Wendy, would you like to start? Sorry, Dora, you're muted.
Thank you, Charles. Shall I just make sure we've introduced all the panelists, because I'm not...
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think, well, at least for the benefit also of people who have just joined, because I think there are some people who have joined in the second part. So yeah, first and foremost, Charles Burdett, Director of IMLR, Wendy Bennett, Professor of French Philology and Linguistics at Cambridge, and PI of MEITS, and currently also working on a project promoting language policy. Michelle MacLeod, Professor of Gaelic at Aberdeen University, we just heard Michelle earlier, and Ludovica Serratrice, Professor of Multilingualism at Reading University, and until very recently, Director of the Center for Literacy and Multilingualism. I hope you've managed to locate everybody on the Zoom. And the Zoom window, so what we'll try to do is, in the first instance, open the what and how of policy making, and towards the end maybe think about where LSP can fit in all that and how it can facilitate policy making. So maybe, yeah, we can start with Wendy, and our first question: what are the key areas of policy making where we think research in languages can have an impact?
Thank you, Dora, and thank you everyone for being here. So I think for me, the key point to emphasise is that we need to raise the profile of languages right across government and try to sensitise policymakers to the vital importance of languages, so that they develop, as it were, a kind of automatic reflex when they're elaborating policy to think, could there be a languages dimension to this work, like they think automatically, is there a gender dimension, is there a race dimension, and so on. I guess if we think more specifically about key areas, we can think about it in 2 ways. We can think about it in thematic priorities of government, or in terms of government ministries and departments. I suppose in terms of themes, research in languages obviously has a lot to say about big inverted commas, global Britain, second big inverted commas, levelling up agenda, but other things as well. And even if we don't like those formulations, even if we're not comfortable with those formulations, it's probably quite important to try and see how we can engage with those priority areas, because those are the ones that policymakers have been asked to work on by ministers. And I suppose in terms of ministries and departments, we always think of DFE, education, that's really crucial, of course, FCDO and GCHQ, both of which have important language training arms. But again, I think if we want languages to be taken seriously in government, we need to kind of try and move beyond some of those obvious areas and make it clear that languages are vital in the Ministry of Defence, so defence and security issues, Ministry of Justice, think of things like court translation, Department of Health and Social Care, all the great work that's going on about health and well-being related to languages, Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. Michelle already mentioned languages and social cohesion and how important that is. The Home Office, integration of refugees, immigration issues, and so on. And I could go on and on, but right across government, I think there are places where we could and should say that languages have a role to play in policy.
Michelle, would you?
Thanks. So I'll take this question really with a minority languages perspective and also thinking about the devolved administrations. But first of all, just to reflect on something that Wendy said there about the need for persuading Westminster to think about the languages question alongside other areas of policy. And I think that that's something that I have seen happen very well in the Welsh government and Welsh administration. And I think that that's something that across the minority languages we would like to learn from other minority language devolved governments, but also I think it's something that Westminster can learn from how they have managed to successfully languageify other aspects of policy. But I think that, as I alluded to earlier, each of the devolved administrations do have a range of legislative and policy measures specifically relating to language, and that includes BSL in Scotland, where we do have legislation supporting promoting BSL. One of the challenges of working in research with policymakers is that of turnaround, and how when policymakers ask for a piece of work that it needs to be done quickly. And that is a real challenge for those of us working in the academy. So that's something that we need to work on. There's also scope for working not just with government, but also NDPBs. And again, there's a number of them in the devolved administrations that have language responsibilities, the minority language responsibilities, and also in broadcasting. I didn't talk about broadcasting earlier on, but that the broadcasters do also look for research to support their work, and that is a big policy issue too. So I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Maybe Ludovica now, your thoughts on from the community heritage languages.
Sure, thank you, Dora. Yes, so I'm coming to this from a slightly different angle, and really from the angle of what people call community languages, heritage languages. So basically, the other languages of those children or pupils that in schools are classified as having English as an additional language. So, and I think, Emmanuel already touched upon this a little bit. And I also think it's interesting that these languages are called community languages. So I think, the label itself already puts these languages on a slightly different plane from modern foreign languages, because you really wonder whose responsibility it is to look after these languages. So probably not schools, not institutions, but the communities, maybe complementary schools, maybe, families. Although there are clearly some community languages where you can get qualification at GCSEs and A levels, but interesting to hear from Emmanuel earlier that in a place like Aston, Birmingham, where Romanian, for example, is very well represented, there is no opportunity, to get a qualification in that language. And again, as some of you may know, sort of clearly this multilingual potential is, I think, still very much untapped. And again, sort of, from census data that about 21% of primary school pupils have got English as an additional language, which means that they've got at least another language that they speak to some extent. Again, the figure is a little bit lower in secondary school, but still about, 17.5%, so not negligible. So we really don't know enough about the untapped potential of these languages. And this is an area where definitely I think policymakers should be interested, because these are people that don't need to be taught in the sense, from scratch at least, because they do have these languages. And really, we know very little in general, even about the development of English as an additional language in these multilingual learners, and even less when it comes to their other languages. So more concerted work and coordination, for example, between mainstream schools and complementary schools could be an area where something, very interesting could be done. The other thing that it was very interesting to hear that again from Emmanuel's report earlier about, or I think it was, I can't remember, maybe it was Nico before, I can't remember. Somebody talked about language use, or maybe Michelle, or maybe all three of you. We know very little about the language background of EAL learners. Often in schools, they don't even record the actual language that these children speak. So again, there is an untapped potential for, for example, doing something as easy as having, just a standard sort of protocol, a school intro, something that could also be repeated over time, because of course, bilingualism, multilingualism is dynamic. And with some colleagues at the University of Leeds and in the Netherlands and in France, we are actually working on a parental language questionnaire that can be used in schools and with speech and language therapists to get to this kind of, to paint a picture of the language background of these users. And then finally, again, I teach on a speech and language therapy degree, and at Reading, because of the Centre for Literacy and Multilingualism, we've also got very good connections with the Institute of Education. So I know firsthand, and again, also talking to colleagues in other universities, that the training, and again, another policy area, the training that our trainee teachers and trainee speech and language therapists get on multilingualism in general is very patchy. So it really depends where you go, basically, where you train, whether you're lucky enough. And at Reading, I think, we're quite fortunate in having a focus on that. But again, there isn't consistent provision. There is no policy in making sure that learning, information and training on multilingual learners and multilingual language development beyond even modern foreign languages is part of the curriculum of trainee teachers of speech and language therapists that will then go into the workforce. So I think these are, three areas that would greatly benefit from consistent policy going ahead, I think.
Thank you, Ludovica. Charles, I know you've been thinking a lot about the link between languages, culture, and society.
Yeah, so I was going to respond to questions 2 and 3, but I'll just say my piece, or possibly a bit later in the.
Okay, or maybe we can just then move on to question 2 and start with you. That might be so.
Yeah,
I mean, we have at least identified a few areas where we think we can make some contributions, but what are the key obstacles? What do we think are the obstacles? What is it that we need to overcome to make impact in those areas, to connect with the policymakers? Yeah,
I mean, the obstacles to overcome impact on policy, I mean, just from my particular angle, especially the IMLR, I think we need to be thinking about modern languages as an extensive disciplinary field whose founding narrative is the integrated study of languages, cultures, and societies. And I think the first point to stress is that policy impact is, of course, not limited to research that is looking exclusively at languages, not that that is in any way possible anyway. There's a job of work, I think, to be done in stressing that all researchers in the disciplinary field can and should think about how their work is relevant to the formulation of policy, what you want to change, why you're doing the particular kind of work that you're doing, even if that is simply working on a particular theoretical framework that you're elaborating with reference to the past. And I think the example to mention here, and I'm sure Wendy will say more about this, is the journal History and Policy, which is known to all historians and is certainly read in Whitehall. History and Policy is an important publication of the School of Advanced Study. And when, for my own grant, we were putting together Transnationalising Modern Languages, we were putting together a policy document in Bristol. Bristol said, well, why didn't you think about publishing it in History and Policy? Well, we didn't, but we would certainly have been, we certainly did talk about it in Languages, Society and Policy. So one of the things I think we need to do across the subject area is to change the way in which people think about research. The IMLR organises a great deal of conferences, workshops, seminars, and outputs. Outputs tend to be blog posts, special issues, edited volumes. But one output that we would like to see people use more is a policy-oriented article or indeed a policy report. And I think one of the main reasons that the IMLR is supporting very strongly LSP is precisely to encourage this connectivity between the events that we organise and thinking about policy-oriented, future-directed research. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. So, concentrated efforts to get the research out and to make an effort to make those policy points clear. Maybe let's go back to Wendy. With all your experience with policymakers, what do you think are the key obstacles here that we need to overcome?
So we've already touched on quite a few of these. So we've talked about balancing the priorities of policymakers with trying to set our own agendas and time constraints. Perhaps just to pick up on Michelle's point, having worked with both Whitehall and the devolved administrations, I would say it is hugely more difficult to deal with Whitehall. That's because I think traditionally, at least, there's been lots of silos in Whitehall and relatively less government coordination, although happily this is now improving vastly with the strengthened Cross Whitehall Languages Group chaired by GCHQ. We've had tremendous support from 2 civil servants working on languages in the Cabinet Office and GCHQ. But practically there are things like the huge churn of civil servants in Whitehall, which means that you kind of build up a relationship of trust with a civil servant. And that's absolutely vital if this kind of collaboration is going to be successful. But then they're moved into another post every 2 or 3 years. And just to perhaps elaborate on the timescale question that is so different, a civil servant may be asked by a minister or a senior colleague to produce some evidence the next day or in the next few days if they're lucky. And I think that gives a role for LSP because we need to be agile and perhaps have a bank of material ready, which we can adapt and supply when the opportunity arises, when somebody contacts one of us and says, I would like information on languages in community schools. We've got these good papers ready. And I suppose the other thing just to say is that this work is kind of slow and painful often. Impact on policymakers can be very slow with ideas being fed into early thinking, perhaps leading to very little concrete evidence in the kind of ref terms. But actually the research-based evidence has been vital in shaping the initial thinking and development of the policy. So I think I'll perhaps pass over to Michelle now.
Yeah, thank you. But there's already, I think, a link between Charles' point that we really need to be consciously making, putting the policy out and the policy recommendations out in the report, and then having a bank there so that we can respond to questions and requests as they come up. Michelle?
Thanks. I think there's also the opportunity to ask policymakers to co-create research or even just to co-create research questions and to get them involved right at the start, or even when individual researchers are starting to work on pieces of on projects, to make contact early on with policymakers, because it's not always the case, it doesn't always happen that way, but even just to get a steer, an opinion, because although policymakers and academics may seem to be working on the same issue, there are of course nuanced differences, and early conversations, even if it's not co-created, I think can make a big difference to the likelihood that the research will then be useful to the policymakers and be used for recommendations. Because not every piece of research that seems to be about a particular policy situation will be picked up or will be suitable for recommendations, and that's sometimes down to the fact that there hasn't been any communication during the research process.
Thank you, Michelle. Okay, more work on alignment. Ludovica?
Okay. So I would say that probably there is also sometimes, I'd say, a lack of understanding on our part, on the part of academics, of how to write for policymakers. So I often read documents that are called policy reports or policy briefings, where the recommendations are, although well-intentioned, rather vague and generic. So I'm just quoting from something I read recently. I won't obviously say where I found it, but it said something. So one of the recommendations for policymakers was, multilingual education is beneficial for the development of language and literacy skills in children. So I would say that from a policymaker point of view, I think it would be quite difficult what to make of a statement like this. And I think policymakers probably want something more practical, more concrete. And I think sometimes academics may be hesitant to provide this kind of advice. I also would have to say they were normally quite cautious and perhaps sometimes unwilling to make categorical recommendations of the type, do X if you want to get, result Y, in the face of what we normally know to be very nuanced and sometimes potentially limited evidence. So I think there may be a little bit of tension between the way in which academics write and think and what they write and what policymakers would like to see when it comes to more practical implementations, I think. And I'm totally guilty of that, by the way. I wasn't accusing anyone of doing a bad job.
No. I mean, I think actually that has been one of the, the challenge in some way, we're still learning that in the policy paper, the LSP policy paper, almost every paper that goes back to the authors, it's about those policy recommendations at the end and how we can flesh them out and, how we can make them more concrete. And I guess it's going to be a learning process for all of us, but probably that is the one area where LSP can help, because that's, the editorial team and the associate editors that read the papers actually can bring some experience and some feedback on that particular point. So I'm also very conscious of the time. So let's then think about bearing in mind everything you've said already. How do we build a coordinated strategy, first of all, as academics, I guess, across disciplines, to then approach policymakers? I think we have already made, a lot of progress today with bringing modern languages and linguistics and the societies together to begin the discussion, but certainly we can think more widely across humanities and potentially engaging with social sciences as well. So maybe Michelle, would you like to start?
Sure. I think one possible way forward is the opportunity to bring people together, to bring policymakers together with languages researchers to begin these early conversations. And I think that we as academics need to be better at speaking more succinctly, she said not very succinctly, to policymakers to make our points brief, because our research is not the priority of the policymakers. So we need to be able to tell our story in a way that we're perhaps not used to. I think perhaps, Dora, you already alluded to that, but we do need to be able to frame our work and our research in a particular way, and we need to get better at doing that. But we do need to have the opportunity to do that.
Thank you. Wendy?
Well, I absolutely agree with Michelle that we need these opportunities for exchanging ideas and becoming aware of each other's priorities. And perhaps I won't say a lot more here, but just to say that one of the great things about co-authoring the recent report with Around Europe on the economic case for languages was that I was able to have a productive dialogue with civil servants throughout the process. I knew that there was a gap. And then we fed drafts to civil servants who gave us guidance, so that meant that there was at least a better chance of it landing well in government towards the end. And I think that kind of model is a very good one. And I suppose just as a final point about LSP, I'd just like to say the hope is that LSP will become the go-to written source for policymakers to find these accessible summaries and policy recommendations, and that it will become baked in a way that, for example, people who are looking for policy ref impact case studies will use LSP as one of the platforms to disseminate their ideas both to academia and to stakeholders and policymakers.
Thank you. Ludovica?
Yes, thanks. I don't think I'm going to say anything very different from the excellent thoughts that Wendy and Michelle have already shared. I'm just thinking, again, going back to something that you also said previously about co-creation, because I guess it's really important. I mean, I think we've all read, for example, grant applications where there is like the science is fantastic, and then there is this section on impact, and it says, and this will be very relevant to policymakers. And I'm just thinking, maybe not actually. Maybe this isn't. You think it's fantastic science, but this is not what policymakers want or need. So, I think we can't do research first and then as an afterthought, if this is one of the drivers of why we do that piece of research, I think it really needs to come from the beginning as much as possible, and identify, key interlocutors that we can find and that will help us shape in a way that actually will be relevant. At the same time, clearly, as academics, we also don't want to be implementing other people's, just, policy-driven agendas. Obviously, it's a fine balance, I guess, between sort of doing the kind of research that we think is valuable, from an academic scientific point of view, and the kind of research that can actually be usable. So I think, some things can be both. I mean, I also, Wendy was saying, maybe not every piece of research has got impact, has got a policy outcome, but if we're doing something that we think might have that, we should then start involving our stakeholders, i.e. policymakers, early on if we have access to them. And I'm sure these are very busy people, so it's probably one of the problems, right? Like, also finding somebody that's got the time and the inclination to do this kind of work, I guess.
Yes, no, thank you. And I think we'll always have to work around these tensions. The question is, through LSP, actually through coordination with the societies, the institutes, other networks, how to make it easier and more realistic for the people who are keen to actually engage with policy, or we want to put the policy implications of the research, first of all, to do it, to be successful, and how we can facilitate that. I'll turn to Charles now.
And I should be very brief, because I'm not going to say anything really very new. I think in a climate such as this, it's very important for subject areas within the humanities to prove the benefits that they offer to society, how they address major societal issues, how the insights that they produce can be applied. That's very, very important. I think there's no shortage of information about that. And I think there are various steps that one can make for a more concerted engagement in policy. And the first is to learn from ready-made examples. I understand that the British Academy is producing a report on REF and impact case studies. And I think that will be very important for us to really study, disseminate, think about, and the way in which you can see how policy develops from research. I think the second stage is not that they follow one from the other, they can be done simultaneously. The second is to be learning from other disciplinary areas, constantly in contact with them, and thinking about their practice. And I think the School of Advanced Study is very well placed for that. For example, we can think about some of the things that the Institute of Philosophy does, or the IHR. And the third is absolutely to take the point that Naomi Wells has made in the chat, and that is to think about various stages in which thinking and writing policy can be built into training by sharing experience and by tailoring it to different stages of a researcher's career. And just my last point, to do all of this, a strong sense of direction and purpose and coordination and collaboration of the disciplinary area is absolutely necessary. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Charles. So we're left with something like 14 minutes, so maybe, I think we now maybe have already some idea of where LSP can help in this daunting task, what looks like it. But, we can certainly continue to make good papers, basically, publish good papers, try to get that research out to the extent possible, maybe pick up some themes for workshops of maybe more thematic, more focused topics to publish on. These are, we can continue this discussion. I would like to turn to the chat, or if anyone would like to ask a question. I think the very first one is from Ike. I hope I'm not misspelling. Does the scope of the journal include context other than the UK? Example language, yes, of course, Ireland. We have actually published, there was an opinion piece by Ian Cullen on the language policy in Ireland, but we have papers, policy papers on multilingualism in Belgium and on the census, collection of census, language census data in Germany. So certainly the journal is open to those contributions. Sometimes, academics from other countries feel more motivated to contribute to more local outlets, but absolutely. Okay, sorry, Leanne had already answered. Hilary, rather than overtly adding in language. So Hilary's question is whether, if I understand it correctly, whether it makes sense to also identify areas of policy where failing to take into account that language has actually, has called into question the efficacy of the policy. Would someone from the panel would like to answer this question?
I can try and say something. I mean, I think, yes, absolutely. Of course, I think we should identify areas of problem. One of the ones that has been bothering me for a long time is the skills agenda. If you look at policy on skills, there's virtually nothing on languages there, which is criminal, really. So I think, yes, we need to do that. I think it's probably more difficult to try and modify established policies than to work on shaping policies while they're being developed. But I think we do need to try and do both things. I don't know whether the others have had experience of being successful on that.
Anyone else? It's actually worth trying. It's a question, how whether policymakers are open to listening and to changing things. So, and then there is a great suggestion by Naomi Wells to think about providing training for language researchers on writing for policymakers. And I think Leanne and I are making a note, and we'll certainly come back to your offer to facilitate via the IMLR. I mean, for the moment, up to here, we have really relied on peer review, on the associate editors, and are trying to help each other. But certainly something more focused is going to be, a very good suggestion, something we can look at. Jonathan Caston. Right. Is this, Jonathan, about lots of recommendations just falling on deaf ears? I suppose this maybe comes back to some of the points Michelle and maybe Wendy and Ludovica made earlier, which have to do with are we really phrasing and are there recommendations, specific enough, or really addressing the context in which policymakers are working so that they can be useful? But maybe someone from the panel would like to say something more about this.
I'll take one part of it. Dora, you were talking about phrasing our recommendations. I think also when we phrase recommendations to policy makers, our recommendations can't be so far away from the current practice. And sometimes that I've seen that with some recommendations coming through research in my own area, very sensible to some degree recommendations, but they're so far removed from current policy that it would be too big a switch. And I think that's something that we fail to understand, how a big change from the current situation is highly unlikely to happen based on one set of recommendations. I don't want to say much more about the Whitehall Group. I know them, but Wendy, did you want to say something about them?
I don't really like to speak for them. I think one member of them might actually be present on this call. I mean, I think in the last year or so there has been huge increase in dialogue between that group and those of us who have been working directly in policy. It's a very open group, and I think it has very much in mind to try and itself find ways of improving collaboration with academics. I think it's very conscious that it needs these channels open just as much as we do, and I feel quite optimistic that there will be increased dialogue. And I think it probably started off as a very narrow group with looking at very internal issues like procurement of services, but it's got a much wider remit now, and I think it's all very positive what's happening, that we've got 2 people dedicated to looking at languages in Whitehall, one more language facing inward, looking at what languages in the civil service, but the other one looking outwards, and I think very aware of the kind of issues that we've been discussing today.
Okay, thank you.
Could I just add to that? I mean, of course, I mean, it's all absolutely part of a dialogue. The more you have documents, the more you have events like the kind of events that MEITS has organised, the more openings there are. I mean, it's very sort of interesting the way in which, for example, one of your most recent event, Wendy, I mean, I was contacted subsequently by 2 policymakers and asked to say a few things about and possibly develop that kind of dialogue. So it is part of creating that dialogic structure, which is extremely important and which we should all be involved in. It isn't simply the question of producing something and then just putting it out there.
Yeah.
It's a sustained dialogue.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you, Charles. And that is perhaps again something we can think around LSP, maybe organize workshops, create some conditions for that dialogue around some topics. I'll go now to Caroline has a question. How do you see the balance between the initiative for new pieces for LSP being with researchers versus coming from the journal editors? It's absolutely both. I mean, and in fact, one of the first motivations, at least for me, for LSP was exactly that, as with any journal, if somebody has a piece of research that has, policy implications, you just submit it to a recognized place, it's reviewed, and it's published, and it's accessed by everyone. It's just a lot of the work we've been doing so far has been us looking, the editorial team looking for papers, just because I think it's not part of the majority of researchers just don't think about publishing policy papers, which goes back to one of the points Charles, I think, made earlier, that people do the research, it's policies either an afterthought or it doesn't exist at all. And not everyone is going to write policy papers, but I think even people maybe who want or to write policy papers, they don't, up until now at least, don't know about LSP. Hopefully more people will learn. So we are certainly absolutely open to people submitting, not just papers, even suggestions for collections, for something more thematic. But I think the journal editors and the consortium, again, probably will still have a steering role in picking up some, again, in order to be able to make those links with the audience we are targeting, which are the policymakers. We'll have to probably do some extra work on thinking about, okay, what are they worrying about? What are the areas? How can we tie things in? But we certainly need to leave open the possibility that some great policy impact will come. We don't even know about it, and the policymakers also don't know about it. So that space is going to be open for new ideas. I hope I have answered. And I don't know if anyone else would like to say something more. It looks like we are coming up to 2 hours. Is there anyone? If there is a question from the audience, you can raise your hand. Or maybe then I would like to thank everybody the authors, the editors, of course, the consortium for their papers, their ideas, their support, the associate editors for reviewing, and well, we'll stay in touch, and we're going to send us your papers and your ideas. That's the most important thing, and you know, we can figure out the rest.
Thank you so much, Dora, and for everyone in LSP. This is an absolutely fundamental resource for the disciplinary area moving forward. I'd just like to conclude by thanking the three fellows for their excellent presentation, and for everyone associated with this afternoon's event. And of course, for everyone coming and for your questions, comments, and observations. We'll come back to this a lot. So very many thanks to everyone.